Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Monday the 6th of October. I'm Caroline Hepker in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels. Coming up today, Japanese stocks soar and the yen weakens as investors react to Sanae Takaichi's pro-stimulus stance as she's on track to become the country's first female Prime Minister.
Israel and Hamas prepare for talks aimed at ending the 2-year conflict that's devastated Gaza and destabilised the Middle East.
Plus an 11,000 to 1 gamble gone wrong. Big banks count the cost after a tiny fund's big bet ends in disaster.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Sanae Takaichi, a pro-stimulus conservative, is poised to become Japan's first female Prime Minister. Japanese equities led Asian stocks to an all-time high following her surprise win in the ruling LDP's leadership race. While equity investors embraced the news, bond markets did not. Longer-dated Japanese bonds slid, with the 40-year yield surging as investors balanced the potential upside of stimulus against debt market risk. With more, here's our editor-at-large in Tokyo, Sherry Ann.
We know that Sanae Takaichi is a nationalist. We know that she's a fan of Margaret Thatcher, a fan of heavy metal music as well. But it's really the pro-growth policies that Sanae Takaichi has talked about that is really the focus for investors. She's talked about the BOJ's easy monetary policy, toned down her rhetoric during this election campaign. But we know that she wants to continue expanding fiscal policy. She's promised cash handouts, tax rebates, hinting at raising the tax-free income allowance as well.
Sherry Ann was speaking as analysts at Goldman Sachs warned that volatility in Japan's longer-dated bonds may now spill over into markets as far away as the US and UK. Scrutiny of longer-dated debt in many developed economies has increased as governments ramp up borrowing and inflation remains stubbornly high.
Now, the growing fiscal concerns in some of the world's biggest economies has seen some investors flock to the perceived safety of precious metals and Bitcoin. Gold hit another record today and is now closing in on $4,000 an ounce, following a glittering run that's seen it surge almost 50% this year. Bitcoin, meanwhile, set another all-time high over the weekend as a broader risk rally around the US government shutdown buoyed the world's largest cryptocurrency.
Hamas representatives have arrived in Egypt for peace talks seen as the most optimistic moment for diplomacy in the war with Israel. US President Donald Trump is pressing both parties to end their near 2-year war and sign up to his 20-point peace plan. Trump told reporters he's honoured to be a big part of it.
They've been fighting for a plan for years. We get the hostages back almost immediately. Negotiations are going on right now. Will probably take a couple of days, and people are very happy about it.
But details of what President Trump's plan would mean for Gaza's long-term future are unclear. For its part, Hamas has said that it will release all hostages if the deal is signed, but haven't yet agreed to disarm. After nearly 2 years of fighting, the UN-backed organisations say Palestinians have been subjected to famine and genocide.
Here in the UK, Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood says that she is considering new laws to ban repeated protests in Britain after pro-Palestine marches over the weekend. Almost 500 people were arrested at a march on Saturday that police and the government had tried to cancel after a terror attack on a synagogue. Mahmood says the large-scale demonstrations over Gaza are causing considerable fear for the Jewish community.
And what I will be making explicit is that cumulative disruption, that is to say the frequency of particular protests in particular places, is in and of itself a reason for the police to be able to restrict and place conditions. That is to say they can move them to a different place, they can restrict the time that those protests can occur on.
Mahmood's critics include civil liberties groups like Amnesty International, who warn the UK's right to protest is being eroded. Reports of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic attacks in Britain are on the rise as security officials fear the war in Gaza radicalising people living in the UK.
French President Emmanuel Macron has appointed a largely unchanged cabinet, with most senior ministers from the previous government staying on. Among the key changes, Roland Lescure, a close ally of the president, becomes finance minister, while former minister Bruno Le Maire returns as defence minister. The announcement has sparked backlash from opposition parties who've demanded a change of course after months of political turmoil that could threaten Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu's survival in Parliament this week. Opposition groups have said they will call a no-confidence vote as soon as he lays out his policy plans in the National Assembly tomorrow.
OPEC Plus has agreed to return 137,000 barrels a day of halted supply to markets, a slower pace than earlier this year. That's despite signs of a global oil surplus starting to emerge and after an earlier difference in position between co-leaders Saudi Arabia and Russia. Our reporter Wei Lun Sun says OPEC producers are each facing different circumstances.
Some, like Russia, is actually trying to contend with increased attacks on its oil production capacity. So that's all pulling back some of that potential production. We do see some estimates for that 137,000 barrels per day that OPEC promised over the weekend. Actually, Russia takes up about a third of that, and a third of that might come under stress because of Ukraine's attacks on oil export facilities.
Bloomberg's Wei Lun Sun speaking there. The decision to drip feed more barrels into the market shows OPEC's commitment to keep battling for a share of the global oil market. But the market's forward curve, which is closely watched by OPEC, is faltering. Wall Street forecasters like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs expect the oil price slide will extend below $60 a barrel.
And those are your top stories on the markets. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index is up slightly on the day, but the standout performer in Asia is the Nikkei in Tokyo, which is 4.7% higher. The Topix up by 3.2%. The Japanese yen 1.9% weaker against the dollar at 150.30, 1.8% weaker against the euro at 176.23. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index 0.3 stronger this morning. The euro trading at 117.23. Euro Stoxx 50 futures are up by 0.1%.
Well, those are the markets. In a moment, we're going to bring you more on the political and market fallout from the surprise choice for Prime Minister in Japan, plus the 11,000 to 1 bet that has burned some of Wall Street's biggest banks. But there is another story that has caught our eye, as ever, this Monday morning. We're going to bring you the case for mechanical watches in a digital age. I love this story.
A Quest for Time, Caroline. What a great title for a piece of, quite frankly, art. So Chris Rovesar has been writing about this from our Bloomberg Pursuits team, about, I suppose, essentially the history of watches, I suppose, discussed around this incredible piece that was created that he went on a private trip to the Louvre to see. It's called La Quête du Temps, so The Quest for Time, made by the Swiss watchmaker Vacheron Constantin. And the piece itself is exquisite. There are photos of it in the article. It's got lapis lazuli, mother of pearl, a gold statuette on top of it. It seems to tell the time, but also your mood and the moon cycles, and probably whether it's going to rain tomorrow by the look of it as well. But it is something that is a work of art, sited in the Louvre, so in its home there, and that prompted this reflection from Chris about the art form of timepieces and also where they are now. You know, we had that big pandemic rush into people buying more watches. That's, of course, now facing the realities of things like tariffs, particularly for Swiss companies as well. But Chris kind of poses the more existential question for watchmakers of, you know, the Apple Watch, does that kill everything? Does the digital device give you the alternative?
It definitely doesn't. I've got a watch and a timer, obviously. I've got, my phone with its digital countdown on it also. But I also wear a watch too. So no, I think the more timepieces you've got, the better. See,
I last wore a watch in 2006.
Really?
Because I stopped wearing one, partly because of being surrounded by clocks at every other moment of my life. But I have to say, reading Chris's piece has made me perhaps reconsider all of those watches people have given me of gifts over the years that are hiding in drawers in various parts of my home. Maybe it's time to take one out. We'll see. Anyway, we'll put a link to the piece in our podcast show notes.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Look, let's get to our main story, though. Japan, where we're seeing major market reaction to the news of a pro-stimulus lawmaker to become Prime Minister. Japanese stocks soaring, the yen weakening to a record low against the euro. Long-dated bonds also selling off. Our Asia News Desk managing editor Jill Desis joins us now for more on this. Jill, good morning. How much do you think markets are reacting to this and what are only really potential policies? Why such a big market reaction?
It's really, I think, comes down to a lot of Takaichi's previous comments when it comes to easy money policy, being very pro-stimulus. I mean, this is somebody that at one point last year described the prospect of the Bank of Japan raising rates as, quote, stupid. She's certainly kind of, toned down her rhetoric a little bit since then. But I think a lot of that in combination with, some things that she said about her expansionist spending policies and tendencies in the past have really kind of, thrown into, relief here this idea that you do have somebody that's really embracing the policies of her former mentor, the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. So I think all of that in combination with each other, you're really seeing traders kind of rush to recalibrate their chances of a BOJ rate hike at the next meeting later this month. You're seeing them kind of start to price in that idea that there could be more stimulus on the way. Again, she has toned down some of her rhetoric recently, but I think that's sort of where the vibe is shifting.
Her win in the LDP leadership race, though, was a surprise. What was it, do we know, that won it for her?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a couple of different factors here. So first of all, point out she did get the most votes in the first round against her opponent, Koizumi, who was assumed to be, somebody, a front runner there. So maybe there's momentum that she was really gaining sort of in those repeated rounds of gunning for this leadership role. But I also think that, look, the LDP, this, leading political party in Japan is kind of in shambles at this point. I mean, the former Prime Minister Ishiba, lost two really critical elections. You've really seeing sort of a historic low in terms of the amount of power and influence this party has. And somebody like Takaichi represents, somebody that could potentially, swing back to the right to attract younger voters who have flocked to some of these smaller populist outfits that, seem to really be capturing a lot of the attention of those younger voters. Maybe she appeals to that crowd. And then I also think the fact that she doesn't come from a storied political family, which is quite unusual for somebody with this level of power in Japan. Her mother was a cop. She came from pretty sort of normal, humble beginnings here, and I think that's something that has the potential to really, kind of resonate, particularly with some of those younger voters.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, in terms of other issues facing Japan, Takaichi has previously said that she would renegotiate Japan's trade deal with the United States. How possible is that?
Yeah, that's one that we're certainly looking out for with a great interest. So what she was talking about just last month was that there could be a renegotiation of the trade deal with the U.S. If the implementation specifically of this really large investment fund doesn't serve Japan's interests. So announced as part of that U.S.-Japan trade deal was the idea of a $550 billion investment fund, U.S. dollars, billion with a B. And I think that that's one thing that she seems to be open to revising. She did say after being newly elected to lead the ruling party that it's not going to be immediately revised, but it does seem to be something that she's certainly taken some great interest in.
Okay, interesting. Jill, thank you so much for your time and for being with us today. That is Bloomberg's Asia News Desk Managing Editor Jill Desis. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this.
Now to some exclusive Bloomberg reporting on the collapse of financial firm BlackBrook back in 2020. Citigroup and Goldman Sachs were among the firms stung by a $2.6 billion trade that's now at the heart of a London lawsuit, raising questions about client checks. Our legal reporter Luca De Paoli is with us for more. Luca, good morning.
Morning.
There are lots of stories about banks making losses on big financial trades. What's different about this one?
So, yeah, I think particularly at Bloomberg and other financial media, we write a lot about banks or funds losing money. But the thing that is so remarkable about this one is who the banks lost money to. There were $250 million of losses sustained in trading with a company that had no real offices, seemingly only one real trader, this guy called Jan Ralph, and net assets of less than £200,000. In the most brutal terms, the trade that cost all of these banks this money was levered about 11,000 to 1. It's not really like any of the losses banks take that I've seen or written about before.
Okay, so what do we know then about Jan Ralph?
So Jan started BlackBrook a little less than a decade ago. He had a sort of peripatetic career in finance, going through a few different firms. He does have a public profile on social media. He's given interviews to newspapers talking about his love of Ferraris, making flights around Asia on a plane that he owns. There's a little bit about collecting watches. But people who follow financial markets have never heard of him and his company, and that's important because a lot of people would like to think that pay attention to markets, that if someone's got a $2.6 billion short bet on treasuries, you would have at least heard of them. Despite being almost totally unknown, Ralph and his company were able to take on one of the most levered trades that I think people have ever heard of.
So why were the banks willing to allow this tiny firm to make such a large trade?
So that's a question that I still like to know the answer to. I'm not sure we totally got to the answer in our piece. My colleague Donal and I spoke to a lot of people with knowledge of Ralph and his trades, but very few of them could even begin to understand how BlackBrook was even allowed to make trades like this. The trades were done way back in 2020. Coronavirus was causing a lot of panic in financial markets. Things were moving around a lot. But that still doesn't really explain why the banks were offering this tiny firm such a huge amount of leverage, why they were effectively lending so much money to this firm. For the banks that lost money, which are big banks like Citi, Goldman, Wells Fargo, you have to wonder how their due diligence enabled BlackBrook to take these enormous positions.
So what happens now? Will the banks get any of their money back, the money that they lost?
So BlackBrook collapsed, as you can imagine, after it incurred all these losses. And the running of the company was taken over by administrators. The administrators are there effectively to make sure that creditors can get as much money as they can back from the collapse. As they became liquidators and looked into the running of the company by Ralph, they decided that they would take a suit against him for wrongful trading in London. They want him to repay something close to £180 million, but it'll be up to a judge to decide whether he has to stump up that cash.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.